right, thanks everyone for joining. Looks like the attendee list has kind of stabilized. We're just a few minutes after. Um, Thanks for joining the office hours today for January. My name is Kelly Smith, and what I'm going to do today is we're going to do a preview of an upcoming piece of functionality, a new feature, if you will, for the recovery service, which is going to allow for long-term retention backups in the automation. So the customer isn't going to have to, create these themselves through some kind of scripting. It's actually built into the UI automation in OCI. So I'll go through a couple slides. I'll talk about the difference between operational backups and long-term retention backups, their uses. I'll talk about the architecture just a little bit, and then we'll go to a demo. So I'll go straight into the UI and we can see what it looks like. If you have questions along the way, please enter them into the Q&A. I've got Marco, Alan, and Tim to answer questions in the background as we're going, and then we'll take additional questions at the end. Okay, so let's get started. So two different backup types we're going to be talking about here. We're going to talk about operational backups. We're going to be talking about long-term retention backups. Um, for operational backups, we're talking about, frequent schedules, daily, hours, minutes. And for long-term retention backup, these are the backups that are less frequent, once per month, once a year. Some people do weekly. Weekly is a little less likely, but that once a month backup and that once a year backup is, is a very common occurrence for things that we're going to hold for long periods of time. The operational backup mostly targets the incremental changes that occur in the database. I want to run a backup so I can get to my most recent changes. So if I have to do a restore, I've got the database up to date. So we're doing incremental database backups on a daily basis. We're doing archive redo log backups maybe once an hour, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, something on a very quick basis. Next, for long-term retention backups, these are full database backups. They're self-contained, so think of it, think of it as like one package that has everything you need to recover the database, but again, is on that less frequent schedule. I'm going to do it at the end of the month, and it's just a representation of the entire database. So it's like a full backup of the database with everything you need to recover the database up to the end of the month. So from an operational backup perspective, as I said, these are for getting the database back to a granular point in time inside of a recovery window. So let's think about, I got a 30-day retention. So I've got backups that'll cover from December 15th to January 15th, and I can restore to any individual point in time in that range. So I could do a restore to January 1st, Happy New Year, to, at 4:34 p.m. On the long-term retention side, it's going to be a very specific point in time. So it'll be, the last day of the month at 11 p.m. So 2300. Operational backups, fast recovery is also essential because typically we're trying to get the database back to a point in time from an operational perspective. Long-term retention backups, recovery is really around compliance demands, right? I've got an auditor who wants to see that I protected the database up to the last day of the month at 11 p.m. Or there's been, we need to go back and look at records from that point in time. Operational backups are retained for days. And the reason they're retained for days is because it's very expensive to be able to hold every single point in time for a really long period of time. So usually that's measured in days. Long-term retention backups, because we're talking about a single point in time for the database, the last day of the month, that's retained for years, 5, 7, 10 years, holding that last day of the month. So for an example, daily database backups, archive redo log backups every 30 minutes, retained for 30 days. And that's that December 15th to January 15th concept where you have that window you can restore to any point in time. Long-term retention backups, that monthly database backup that happens at 11 p.m., and we retain it for 5 years. So we've got that single point in time, not as heavy as operational backups that cover a large range in time. You got that single point in time. It's held for 5 years. And again, primarily for compliance, we need to get back to that one point in time. Okay, from an architecture perspective, we have all of our different database service types: Exadata database service, base database, database at Azure, database at GCP, database at AWS. Um, that all, from an integration with the recovery service, you've got real-time protection and incremental forever. Those are the operational backups that are coming in on a regular basis. You've got end-to-end encryption and validation happening to make sure that all those operational backups are ready to go to recover the database very quickly to a single any point in time in your recovery window. That's the operational side. From there, your long-term retention backups would go off to, in the case of this integration, this feature, off to OCI, infrequent access object storage. It's it's a backup you're not going to restore on a regular basis. They're going to be held for long periods of time. So we're going to put them in a lower tier of storage, if you will, lower cost um, storage tier, and hold that for a really long time. And we're going to have that single point in time, held for compliance reasons. All of this infrastructure that's holding the backup, that's all in an Oracle managed tenancy. That's been one of that's the architectural premises behind the recovery service. We have the separation from the production databases, and all these backups would be held in an Oracle managed tenancy, and that gives you some protection from malicious behavior. Now, with the infrequent access object storage, we've also extended our end-to-end encryption and validation to help ensure that you've got, security and recoverability across a larger life cycle, if you will. We've got those backups are going to be held for a long period of time out in infrequent access, and they get, mixed in with the validation process for the recovery service to make sure that they're, still present, still accessible, and ready for recovery. Now, the trick we do, of course, the recovery service is all about making sure that the database doesn't have to do heavy lifting, right? We're doing incremental forever to get changes from the database into the recovery service to cover your operational recovery window. Now, for creating backups for long-term retention, we don't want to put that load back on the database and have the database create this full package that we're going to keep for multiple years. Instead, the recovery service uses the existing operational backups that are already stored in the recovery service to create this point in time that you need to hold for multiple years. So that means that this process doesn't put any operational overhead on the production database. You don't, that infrequent access, long-term retention backup that you're storing for multiple years is a full representation of the database. We don't want the database to do that work. So we're offloading that into the recovery service. The recovery service itself is going to use existing backups to then create the long-term retention backup. Okay, so now let's get into the demo. So I'm going to switch screens here and we're going to actually go into the OCI demo. Let's see, we want this. Share. Okay, so this is my database. I'm using a base database in this case. So these are my database details. I've got automatic backup enabled on this database. It's healthy. I've got I got a 1 second data loss exposure because I'm using real-time protection. Again, these are all operational backup attributes. So I've got the database protected up to 1 second ago. Now, if I go down here under backups, I can create a backup And now you'll see I can create a long-term retention backup. So the long-term retention backup, I can give it any range that I want from 90 days to 10 years. So we'll just say we'll make this one 5 years. And you give it a name. Let's see, we're going to do monthly January 2025. You can give it any name you want, just something that lets you know what it is. You can put the database name in there. This is a free form field. You can put, whatever you want into this field. Um, and I'm going to specify that it's a long-term retention backup, and I'm going to hold it for 5 years. Now you click create. And now behind the scenes, the recovery service is building this long-term retention backup. It's going to be based on the operational backups that already exist for the database. So we're not touching the database during this operation. And when it completes, you'll see this is one that I created on Friday, and I just called it monthly. So when it completes, you'll see has long-term retention. If I scroll to the right, you can see my expiration date. For this one, it's January 16th, 2026. Because I told it to have a 1 year retention. So that is the expiration date for this backup is a year after I created it. Out here on the end, I can create a database from that backup. So we're not going to restore, obviously, long-term retention backups back to the database. I don't want to ruin my production database with a backup that's multiple years old. So we create databases out of these backups. And that goes through the standard create database workflow. So if I click create database workflow, it asks me what I want to do. Um, and you'll notice as part of that, I can put it into a different compartment. I can give it a different name. I can put it in a different region. I've got all these different regions to choose from in my tenancy. I can change the shape of the database. So if it was, if I'm just doing this for compliance, I don't need to make it a huge database. I can turn that way down. Um, and not have to use all those database resources in my environment. And then, you step through this, it would use the backup to create the database in your environment, wherever you tell it to go. The other thing that I can also do is I can change the retention on this database. So I can click change retention, and now it's set for 1 year. 1 year. I can change that. I could change that to 3. Save the changes, and then that database backup would have a different retention period based on when it was created. All the retention periods are based from the time the database was created because that's your retention period. Um, so it would change the retention period for this database backup. Um, you see, and then of course, because these are independent backups, think of these backups, as I mentioned, they're all self-contained. Um, and represent the database in their entirety. You can also delete these. So if someone created one by accident, you could also delete these. So the first iteration of the implementation, you have full reign around the ability to change your retention period, to delete the individual backups for the database that are in long-term retention. You'll notice if I go to this, I can't delete a backup that is created by the policy because these are incremental backups. They're all associated to each other. So you can't just delete an individual database backup. But the long-term backups that are like a self-contained entity, if you will, that represent the database for a single point in time, you can change those backups, both in retention length, and you can delete them, which has been, the object storage implementation for quite some time. This process last time took about an hour to get all the components together. So we show the start and end time. And then, like I mentioned, the expiration date. So I've started this. It'll probably run for an hour or so, and then create that representation of the database at that point in time. Um, the other thing that happens behind the scenes, of course, because we have automation involved, we've captured this point in time. We have database encryption. So the metadata that is necessary to recover that data and also the encryption keys, if it's Oracle managed, are also protected to ensure that, we've got the keys that are necessary to recover this long-term retention backup. And that's, of course, if they're Oracle managed. If it's a customer managed key, the customer needs to ensure that they've got the keys to restore these databases 5 years from now. Um, so, that's important to remember is the key, you will need a key because these are all encrypted to get back to that data. And if it's Oracle managed, we take care of um, the life cycle of the keys along with the life cycle of the database. Are there any questions? Looks like there's something in the QA. Okay. Yes. So there's a question about, how to manage the life cycle. So for long-term retention backups, they're not wrapped into the policy. So for operational backups, for backups that are protecting the database, let's go look at this real quick since we had this question come up. We'll go look at the recovery service. And if I go look at my protection policies, I can enable retention lock. So retention lock is for operational backups. These are for the backups that we need to get the database recovered to a single point in time. With long-term retention backups, the backups are not integrated into this protection policy because you're creating backups that are being stored for a long period of time. So in this integration with long-term retention backups, this first round, um, the backup protection period is not integrated in the policy. You set it on each individual backup creation, and then you can adjust it from there. We're looking at some integrations in, longer term that will put the long-term retention backup process into the policy. And once that happens, you'll have the capability to lock these in place and be more stringent around protection of these long-term retention backups. Any other questions?
There's a question on the Q&A regarding immutability, if those are on immutable object storage and how to release those backups in extreme cases. Is there anything
Yeah, that's what I was just talking about, Tim.
you
So
know?
the
Okay,
backups that are sent to long-term retention don't have. Here, let's go back to that backup. Like if we look at this, they're not wrapped into the immutability. You can delete
right,
this backup. Um, Longer term, as another project coming in the future, we'll wrap
right.
the long-term retention into the policy. So the long-term retention backups will become part of the policy. We can call that, the V2 release, where you'll have more control over break glass and, not allow the long-term retention backups to be altered or deleted. In the first iteration here, though, the customer administrator has free uh, choice, if you will, to
Yep.
manipulate these both the retention time and can delete these individual backups.
Okay. Thanks.
The other thing to remember also, the creation of the backup is done through recovery service. Remember, I said, recovery services gathering all the pieces that will then store the backup into um, OCI infrequent access. The recovery service is also going to do all the maintenance on those backups. So when this expiration period comes around, The recovery service will do the cleanup automatically. It's wrap the life cycle around those backups. This will get cleaned up automatically. When you do a recovery, the recovery goes through the recovery service. So our man asks the recovery service, that's your backup destination for this long-term retention backup. So there's no customer access directly to the object storage location where the backups are stored. The recovery service is the customer and our man's contact point to get to those. And that's how we do protection of the backups behind the scenes. Is everything comes to the front end of the recovery service. That's how we wrap the life cycle around those. And then there's a question, would this work for other cloud point platforms where OCI is offered? I think the question's around like we'll say database at Azure, for example. Um, this this functionality would support database at Azure, but the only long-term retention location that is supported is an OCI location. So that means that your operational backups, the backups you configure up here, when we configure automatic backups in a policy setting, you can say, hey, keep my operational backups in Azure. So Azure database, Azure backups for recovery service. For long-term retention, however, the recovery service at this point only knows how to talk to one storage location, and that's an OCI object storage location. So that means that the backups for long-term retention would leave the Azure data center and go to the OCI data center behind the scenes. Um, Again, seamless to the customer, but that would change the locality of the long-term retention backups because they would be stored in OCI. OCI is the only storage location that we support right now for the recovery service. Okay, any other questions? Again, this is the preview. I'll point this out. So this is a preview. You'll see this functionality start rolling out over the next few weeks, and it'll be live for customers.
Seems to be a couple more Q&A questions there, Kelly.
Okay. Oh, there's another one. Here we go. Um, okay, I answered this one. Can long-term retention backups and recovery service alongside data guard at so any considerations? So you can use this in conjunction with data guard. So data guard's a database configuration. The recovery service would talk to the data guard infrastructure, the data guard technology, if you will, backup or a primary and a standby. The recovery service would talk to that primary or standby database to create the operational backups, just like a standalone database. And then when you tell the recovery service that you need to create a long-term retention backup, that doesn't matter if it's a data guard instance or not. It would just use the backups that were created of the data guard instance, whether that be primary or standby, to create the long-term retention backups. So from a workflow perspective, it's exactly the same. The long-term retention creation process doesn't care what the role of the database is, standalone, primary, standby, it doesn't care. So data guard would work just fine. And then from a recoverability perspective, as I mentioned before, you would create new backups or new databases from these backups. So you would still go through the same create database workflow. Any other questions?
I guess a side question, Kelly, like just thinking about was if I have object storage um, long-term backups, can those be uh, can those be made aware behind recovery service, or would have to be kept separate and
Yeah,
managed
so
separately
yeah,
still?
so that's that, any type, let's take that up to a higher level, right? Any backups that are created outside of automation, the automation doesn't know about. So let's say you were doing manual backups, operational backups, or long-term retention backups, as you mentioned, Tim. Um, when you go in and configure automatic backups, the automation doesn't know about those backups. They were created by hand by a user, by a DBA, uh, and they live their life cycle separate from the automatic backups. We don't know that they were created. We don't know that they exist. They just stay where they were. Um, so only the backups that were created with the automatic backup functionality are managed by automatic backup. Um, so if you had a long-term retention backup that was created, it would not show up in this backup list. You'd have to go and um, retrieve that backup through your manual processes and make your RMAN connection to the location where that backup lives. Are the
Thank you.
long-term backups in object store? Yes, yes. So there's a question do they live in object storage? And the answer to that is yes. We're taking them to a lower tier in object storage has this tiering concept. They're in the infrequent access tier in object storage. But that is in an Oracle managed object storage. So it's behind the recovery service. And then, like I mentioned before, we're wrapping the lifecycle and metadata around that. So our man just simply has to ask the recovery service for backup and recovery operations, and the recovery service handles all the lifecycle management behind the scenes. Okay. Any other questions? Give me just a couple minutes. Here, I'll go back to the slide real quick. Show the back one more. So long-term retention goes to OCI, infrequent access object storage. And again, keeping that operational overhead off the database. We want to make sure that the touch on the database is as light as possible. So recovery service is gathering the incremental changes. They live in the recovery service. And then when you create a long-term retention backup, the recovery service is gathering those changes to create a full representation of the database for the point in time and sending it off to infrequent access. And if there are no more questions, then we can wrap it up here. Thanks everybody for joining us on a Friday. If you have any topics that you would like us to cover, please give us feedback on the AskTOM website. We're always happy to cover, topics that revolve around backup and recovery. There was one last question about, and I didn't mention this, the part numbers and SKUs. So there are SKUs and part numbers that would represent long-term backups. At release time, we'll update the services descriptions, documentation in OCI to list out all of the part numbers that are associated with long-term retention backups. So you'll see that. We'll also have a blog that covers all those details as well. So thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next month on the Ask Tom office hours. Good day.